Could a railway meant to unite Malaysia end up tying the country down with decades of debt instead? That is the uncomfortable question hovering over the East Coast Rail Link, a mega project once sold as a game-changer for national development, but increasingly scrutinized as a potential financial burden for future generations. In this video, we explore why the East Coast Rail Link was conceived, the economic promise it was meant to deliver, and how this mega project could instead leave Malaysia facing serious long-term debt. The East Coast Rail Link, or ECRL, is one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in Malaysia's history. Stretching across peninsular Malaysia, from the Klang Valley to Kelantan, it is designed to physically and economically link the underdeveloped East Coast states with the country's industrial and commercial heartland in the west. On paper, it promises faster travel, cheaper logistics, greener transport, and a narrowing of Malaysia's long-standing regional inequality. But beneath those promises lies a far more complex story about debt, governance, political turnover, and the long shadow cast by foreign-financed megaprojects. The origins of the ECRL date back to 2016, when it was announced as a flagship infrastructure project under the administration of Najib Razak. At the time, Malaysia was aggressively pursuing large-scale developments to push the country into the ranks of the world's top economies by 2050. The ECRL was framed as a strategic artery that would unlock the economic potential of Kelantan, Terengganu, and Pahang, states that had long lagged behind the West Coast in income levels, industrialization, and investment. The logic was straightforward. Malaysia's West Coast, anchored by Penang, Kuala Lumpur and Johor, had benefited from decades of concentrated development. Ports, highways, rail lines and industrial zones clustered along this corridor, while the East Coast remained comparatively isolated, separated by the rugged Titiwangsa mountain range and dependent on congested highways and slow rail services. The ECRL was meant to change that equation by cutting travel time between Gombak and Kota Baru from at least 7 or 8 hours by road to around 4 hours by rail, while also creating a land bridge for cargo between Port Klang on the Malacca Strait and Kuantan Port facing the South China Sea. From the beginning, the project was deeply intertwined with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Financing for the ECRL came largely from a loan by China's Export-Import Bank, covering about 85% of construction costs, with the remaining portion raised domestically through Islamic bonds. A Chinese state-owned giant, China Communications Construction Company, was appointed the main contractor. In effect, the ECRL became the largest Belt and Road project in Malaysia, symbolizing both deepening economic ties with China and growing dependence on external financing. Even at its launch, however, questions were raised about whether the project's economics added up. The original cost was enormous, and critics noted the absence of a publicly released cost-benefit analysis explaining how passenger fares, freight charges, and associated development would be sufficient to service the loan over time. These concerns intensified after the change of government in 2018, when Mahathir Mohamad returned to power. Mahathir's administration took a far more skeptical view of the ECRL. Faced with ballooning national debt and shaken by the fallout of the 1MDB scandal, the new government reviewed major infrastructure commitments inherited from its predecessor. The ECRL was temporarily cancelled in 2018 amid fears that its financing terms were unfavourable and that Malaysia could be saddled with unsustainable repayment obligations. At that point, the project became a lightning rod for broader anxieties about governance, transparency, and the risk of entering into lopsided agreements with foreign lenders. After months of negotiations, the project was revived in 2019 under revised terms. The overall cost was reduced, the alignment was changed, and some elements, such as double tracking, were deferred to cut expenses. The revived ECRL was presented as a more affordable, more rational version of the original plan. Yet crucially, many details of the renegotiated loan agreement with China's Export-Import Bank were never fully disclosed to the public. While officials insisted that the revised project no longer posed a debt trap risk, the lack of transparency itself became a source of unease. Today, the ECRL is nearing completion. Construction has surpassed 90%. Tunnels have been bored through the Titiwangsa Range, tracks laid, and electric systems installed. The line is scheduled to begin operations in January 2027, with a later extension to Port Klang. Trains capable of carrying over 400 passengers per set are being delivered, and freight locomotives are being prepared to move containers and bulk cargo across the peninsula. The benefits, at least in theory, are substantial. For passengers, the ECRL offers a faster, more comfortable alternative to long bus rides and gridlocked highways, particularly during festive seasons when travel times can stretch to 12 hours or more. For students, workers, and families shuttling between the Klang Valley and the East Coast, the line promises predictability and relief from road congestion. For freight, the ECRL is expected to generate around 70% of its revenue by shifting goods from trucks to rail, reducing logistics costs, highway wear and tear, and carbon emissions. Strategically, the ECRL could reshape Malaysia's role in regional trade. By linking Port Klang and Kuantan Port, it offers an alternative route for cargo moving between the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea, potentially shaving a day off shipping times and reducing reliance on congested maritime lanes. If extended northwards and connected to Thailand's rail network, it could one day form part of a broader Pan-Asian rail corridor stretching towards China. But these potential gains rest on a critical assumption that the ECRL will be sufficiently used. This is where the debt risk begins to loom large. The ECRL is not a high-speed rail line. With operating speeds of up to 160 km per hour, it sits between conventional rail and true high-speed systems. To save costs, much of the line is single-track, meaning trains travelling in opposite directions must pass each other at designated loops. This design limits frequency, increases the risk of delays, and constrains capacity, especially as demand grows. Operationally, it is more complex and less flexible than a fully double-tracked system. Passenger demand projections have been described by some analysts as optimistic. Malaysia's existing rail operator has historically struggled to attract high ridership even on routes serving denser, more urbanized regions. The East Coast states served by the ECRL have smaller populations and lower levels of daily intercity travel. While festive surges are real, sustained year-round demand is far less certain. If fares are set too high to recover costs, passengers may stick with buses or private cars. If fares are kept low to attract riders, revenue may fall short. Freight projections face similar uncertainty. While rail is cheaper and greener than road transport in theory, logistics companies make decisions based on reliability, pricing, last-mile connectivity, and turnaround times. The ECRL does not run directly to port berths, meaning containers must still be transferred between trains and ships, adding handling costs. Trucking remains flexible and deeply entrenched. Without strong incentives or regulatory pressure, shifting large volumes of cargo to rail may prove harder than anticipated. This gap between projected and actual usage is where financial trouble can begin. The ECRL loan must be serviced regardless of whether trains are full or half empty. If operating revenue fails to cover loan repayments, the burden ultimately falls on the project owner, Malaysia Rail Link, and by extension, the federal government and taxpayers. Here, the experience of Indonesia offers a stark warning. Indonesia's Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail project, also built with Chinese financing, was launched with similar fanfare as a symbol of modernization and regional competitiveness. Yet soon after operations began, the project ran into losses, cost overruns, and lower than expected ridership. Liabilities mounted, and by 2025, Indonesia was in talks with China to restructure the debt. Crucially, political leaders who had championed the project were no longer in office when the financial consequences became clear. The parallels are unsettling. Like Indonesia's rail project, the ECRL spans multiple political cycles. Governments change, ministers rotate, and priorities shift. Yet the debt remains fixed. There is a real risk that future administrations may inherit repayment obligations without having been responsible for the original decisions, creating incentives to deflect blame rather than confront structural problems. Malaysia's own history adds to the concern. Past megaprojects have shown how ambitious visions can morph into long-term liabilities when demand, governance, or transparency fall short. From underutilized developments to high-profile financial scandals, the lesson is clear. Size and symbolism do not guarantee economic viability. To be clear, most analysts do not believe Malaysia is on the brink of a Chinese debt trap. The country has stronger fiscal institutions, legal safeguards, and a more diversified economy than some Belt and Road recipients. But debt distress does not require collapse to be damaging. Even manageable loans can crowd out future spending, limit policy flexibility, and impose opportunity costs for decades. The opacity surrounding the ECRL's updated loan terms remains a key weakness. Without clear public disclosure of interest rates, repayment schedules, and contingency clauses, it is difficult for citizens to assess the true scale of the risk. Transparency is not merely a governance ideal, it is a financial safeguard. It deters mismanagement, builds public trust, and allows early course correction before problems escalate. The joint venture arrangement between Malaysia Rail Link and the Chinese contractor to operate the line introduces another layer of complexity. While risk-sharing can align incentives, it also blurs accountability. If the ECRL operates at a deficit, losses are shared. But the strategic and fiscal consequences of prolonged underperformance would still weigh most heavily on Malaysia. Ultimately, the ECRL's fate will hinge on what happens beyond the tracks. Railways do not generate prosperity in isolation. They require complementary policies, industrial development, land use planning, and coordination between federal and state governments. Industrial parks, logistics hubs, tourism nodes, and urban development around stations must materialize at scale and at speed. Without them, trains may run, but economic spillovers may remain thin. This is where urgency matters. Once operations begin, the clock on debt repayment keeps ticking. There is limited room for gradualism. Demand must be cultivated early, freight contracts secured, and integration with ports and road networks optimized. Otherwise, the ECRL risks becoming operationally functional but financially fragile. So, could the East Coast Rail Link land Malaysia in trouble? The honest answer is that it could, if optimism replaces realism and ambition outruns discipline. The project carries real promise, but also real risk. Debt does not become dangerous overnight. It becomes dangerous when warning signs are ignored, projections go unchallenged, and accountability fades with political change. Malaysia has placed a bold bet on connectivity. The question now is whether it has done enough to ensure that this railway connects the country to opportunity rather than binding it to debt. But the ECRL is not the only rail megaproject being touted as a force that could reshape Malaysia's future. In December 2025, a new electric train service in Johor Bahru was launched, with some hailing it as a practical alternative to the cancelled Kuala Lumpur to Singapore high-speed rail. But despite the optimism, this project can never truly replace the HSR. Watch the next video to find out why.